いかがですか渡辺なんです。Today, let's talk about how we got into the situation we're in right now. And the way we got here actually began in the 1990s, but I'm not going to go that far back. What I want to do instead is to discuss the problems that happened with the advent of streaming online. This began in approximately 2006 when Netflix, which had already made an absolutely tremendous business out of out of renting DVDs and solving a problem many people had had with Blockbuster. And that is if you kept your DVD for longer than the period you were supposed to, they would charge you an incredible late fee. And so Netflix handled that by merely making it a monthly subscription fee, which Blockbuster did not take seriously. In fact, there's lots of anecdotal stories about how Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy Netflix and stop their destruction, but they were so arrogant that they ignored that opportunity. And thus, they are now basically gone with only one or two stores, which are left as more or less a novelty item. What Netflix did was it actually accumulated one of the most incredible databases that had ever been done on movies and how audiences reacted to them. And the way they did this is from the very beginning, whenever someone would rent a DVD from them, they not only kept a record of the top line items about that movie, the main stars, the genre, the director, sometimes even the screenwriter, but they went much further down the cast list and they went into a lot of other elements that were within the story. So that's why when you were looking at titles and Netflix made a recommendation for you, especially after you'd rented about 15 or so, they were able to start predicting very, very unique titles that had always been in the back of your mind to rent at some point, but you never quite gotten around to it. And now all of a sudden that's popping up on your queue. And for many, it was almost like a miracle. It was almost like Netflix had some kind of psychic ability to figure out what you wanted, when you wanted it, and why you wanted it. Well, one of the reasons it had such a magnificent database is they were the only ones who were doing that. Everyone else was just focused on the top two or three items. So that's why Netflix had such a hegemon and such a leap forward. When they started streaming, it was done a little bit experimentally, but they also knew their history. One thing you can never say about Netflix is that Red Hastings and Ted Sarnoff weren't students of what works. And the way they did it is by being entrepreneurs. They were entrepreneurs first and tech guys second. This is a mistake that many people make when they look at what Sarandis and Hastings did and disconnect it from their entrepreneurship and focus only on the tech. Yes, the tech was incredibly important, but what was more important than that was that they were ready to pivot on a dime and take risks. Once they had a win, they were willing to take that win and make further wins from it. They properly suspected that among rich communities, which tended to have high-speed internet available, maybe for a premium price, but nonetheless they had it, that they could start with that group and then move into the mainstream population. Can we say this is the way that television initially entered the picture? This is the way old radio, when the networks first began in the late 20s, early 30s, began. It starts out with the high end, and then gradually, or sometimes rapidly, you have people go from something being a ridiculous expense to being, I must have it. I mean, I was someone who was a teenager when home video first started. And I got to tell you, I was willing to take jobs incessantly in order to save money enough to buy an early video cassette recorder and my initial 18 blank tapes. And I know that sounds ridiculous now, but it was the early days of home video. And it was such a miracle to be able to actually have a machine that could record the picture as well as the sound. So I was fascinated by it. And yes, those blank tapes, which at that time, we were really happy because they were only $15 each. Can we say that's almost 60 or 70 of today's dollars for a blank tape? And even when I went to USC and the tapes had dropped to about $10, that's still $40 in today's money. And I thought that was so cheap. I started recording everything in Beta 1 because it had much better quality than VHS SP or Beta 2, which was the Beta standard format. So starting with the pioneers and the people who love that technology, it rapidly moves downwards in the food chain. I mean, within 2 or 3 years of me living here, the cost of a video recorder had dropped from over $1,000 down to $200. And it's still a lot of money in today's world, but at that time, that was such a substantial drop. It was almost unbelievable. So what Hastings and Sarandis had done was they were aware of that proclivity. So when they started doing broadband on and using streaming on that, even though it was subject to stuttering and the infamous spinning balls and all that other stuff, it captured people's imagination that you could actually watch a movie at home on your computer without even having to have a DVD player. So that started picking up. And again, Netflix was the only company doing it. So now they had two sets of data. You had the data for the people who were early adopters, and you had the data for your average consumer. So you had a killer database on all levels. And what happened after that? What happened after that is in 2013, Netflix took a plunge and dove headfirst into the water with original programming. And they did it with House of Cards, which was very expensive. Now, this is where I think Netflix made a mistake. It didn't seem like it at first, but it was. And perhaps only those of us who had been in the world during the time when home video crashed out saw the warning signs early. But we weren't sure. And what those warning signs were is that Netflix jumped over the usual trajectory of the way different windows operated in the world of multiple windows. Multiple windows being you'd have a theatrical release if the movie was a feature film and not something direct to video, home video, followed by pay cable, followed by basic cable slash first run syndication, then followed by reruns. So you had 5 windows of distribution, and each of those windows could have subdivided windows. For example, in home video, you would have multiple tiers. It would start out as primarily a rental, which would cost $100 per cassette for the rental shop. After it had been in that window for about 3 months, it would drop in price to where people could buy it. $30, then $20, then $10. So by the time it hit the $30, it was also making its premium cable debut, whether that was on Cinemax, well, I mean, not Cinemax, HBO, Cinemax, Showtime, whatever. It would then sit there and maybe go from HBO to Cinemax. Although that didn't always happen. Cinemax had its own thing at that time. So did the movie channel. So it from Showtime. So there was some hesitation. Then as it would go down, it would continue to expand its exposure. But when you look at most of these other systems, they had a very unusual way of growth. And this began with home video and HBO. And that is you would start with cheap programming. And what does that mean? That meant you weren't putting a lot of dollars out there, or you were splitting the risk. For example, in the early days of HBO, when they would run a movie, they would run the movie and there'd be nothing between that and the next movie except a countdown on screen. And most of those movies were licensed for what was not, by today's standards, certainly not a heck of a lot of money. And when they started doing their own programs, what they started with was they started with specials about the other things they were showing, such as documentaries about movies, EPK, the electronic press kits. Often they were provided by the studios, but they started filling in those gaps with very cheap programming. Basic cable. What did many basic cable channels start out with? They started with reruns, or they started with old movies, such as the old hour-and-a-half movies that used to be on the ABC Tuesday movie, like Dining Room Only, or Bad Ronald, or Home for the Holidays, or the Steven Spielberg early movie Duel. And that was what would make up their schedule. And as they got increasing number of viewers, their programming would increase. You'd start off with cheap, then you'd start with perhaps documentary series or talk shows, maybe even game shows, although game shows tended to be a little bit more expensive than many people think. And then from there, you would start off with one-offs, which would be like a mini series or something like that. And if that worked, then you would start making, or at least acquiring, movies. And then from the movies, you would jump to regular 1 hour dramas. And from there, most didn't go this far. Most after that would jump, or the ones that did try it would jump into sitcoms, which tended to be the most expensive shows and the most risky, but potentially the most lucrative later. But there was sufficiently enough stuff coming off network to where a lot of times that expense was considered excessive, although you still had it happen in the same way you had That's My Mama and What's Happening being, and the new Gidget happening on first run syndication all the way until Star Trek The Next Generation started. What happened with House of Cards was that it was an expensive thing right off the bat. And that meant that Netflix had set itself not to go through the normal stages. And that seemed okay because Netflix was growing by leaps and bounds. And certainly the stunt of doing House of Cards took a lot of people who hadn't gotten off the dime yet to subscribe to Netflix. And that was how they continued to grow as the technology grew. And like many film companies, which decided to jump into the high end in order to make a name for themselves, most infamously Carolco, which on the strength of First Blood, the Sylvester Stallone movie, they did a stunt that no one believed would work. And that is in a world where a wide release was considered somewhere between 500 and 1,000 prints. They released First Blood in over 2,000. I know today we have 4,000, but at that time, 2,000 was considered irresponsible. And they said, you will not make more money beyond your first week. And Mario Casar said, so what? Which no one else had ever said. He says, I'm not looking for legs, meaning I'm not looking for a long play out. I'm looking to make money at the top, not build it. And sure enough, it worked magnificently. And then what Casar did is he made the offer to Sylvester Stallone to pay him $20 million a picture from then on. And that shocked Hollywood because that was double what you were paying actors like Paul Newman, who was having a second renaissance in his career as he was getting older. But that suddenly made everyone's salary that as a peak. And you had other stars being paid that by Mario Casar. So everyone started flooding toward Carol Code because it was spending money. Now, Netflix picked up on that part because they had spent more than people wanted in order to, or more than people were normally asking in order to do House of Cards. They suddenly sensed that perhaps, and don't think Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos weren't pushing this, that they could spend more money as well. And they started advertising that they were willing to do projects that people didn't want to support on the studio level because they were too expensive. But they could get major stars and major directors to commit to them because they were giving them carte blanche to spend like drunken sailors on shore leave. And at that time, Netflix was growing by so much that venture capital was pouring in at an amazing rate. And remember, we were still recovering from the banking disasters of 2008. So interest rates were low. So people were willing to be a little bit more risky with their money. And it looked like, because Netflix was on this growth cycle, that they could keep it up. And sure enough, Netflix was benefiting. Netflix looked like they were going to be the leader. And in fact, for a while they were. But while they were doing this, they were stacking up debt and stacking up debt and stacking up debt. So again, those of us who had been there for a while looked at that and said, yeah, they're increasing their subscriber base, but they are taking on really scary amounts of debt. But hey, it seemed to be working, right? Well, Carolco worked until it didn't, because Carolco went from doing Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct to doing Showgirls and Cutthroat Island and being out of business. So this was a danger, but everyone was still flocking to them. And at the same time, you had the other studios start saying, hey, Netflix is making all of this money. We should be making this money too. Why should we give away the farm to Netflix? Let's all create a streaming service. And this, my friends, is where the shark was jumped. Because remember, Netflix has this big database that had all the movies, all the stuff that they were creating on their own. So they knew what the public would pay for. Now, all of a sudden, the studios started pulling their titles back. And remember, they're not only pulling back their big titles, they're pulling back old reruns. They're pulling back cartoons. They're pulling back I Love Lucy's. And in the process of doing that, what's happening to Netflix's database? Every time someone pulls out or starts pulling their library away, their database becomes less strong. Because now its database is only the Netflix world. This will not come into play too badly until the COVID era. But the danger was beginning, because once you didn't control everything that was out there, once you didn't have an exclusive hand on all of that data, you started making guesses, because now your set of data is limited. And because the data became increasingly limited, Netflix started making mistakes. And the reason it started making mistakes is because it started spending too much for certain things that their data wouldn't have really supported. Let's take one of the most infamous examples. And that infamous example is The Irishman. Now, when you think of The Irishman, it's a Martin Scorsese movie. It's kind of a homeschool reunion where you're seeing all of your familiar players doing their regular shtick, almost like a That's Entertainment as a drama, right? And they've spent a lot of money on de-aging the people, but you still had something that was not that special, that was kind of long, kind of self-indulgent. And the studios, when that had been pitched to them, were basically saying, Marty, we love you. We love your movies. We're not going to give you $175 million for this. You have had no hits. Maybe Goodfellas or Casino, but even those were not the kind of money that you needed to make back from $175 million spent. And I know you can look the other way and say, yeah, but isn't that a big publicity stunt? You're spending $175 million for this piece of IP, and won't that be exciting for people? Because now they can see something that's quite unique and quite expensive. That's publicist talk. What you have to look at is how many people will subscribe because of that program. And I hate to say it, the number of people who would subscribe to Netflix and stay for approximately 5 years just because of that one show, that's not a good investment anymore. That's an awful lot of money. And they were doing it with an awful lot of stuff. But again, they were still pretty much the only game in town, because the other networks hadn't started out yet. And sure enough, they tried The Irishman in theaters, and Netflix was very smart about the publicity there. They were saying, we'll try a theatrical release, but we're really interested in streaming. Mistake number 2. And why is this mistake number 2? Because what Netflix was thinking at this moment, and it's not as if they were the only ones thinking it, Wall Street Bros and the other studios were all thinking the same thing, and that is the amount of money that we can make on streaming could mean we don't have to worry about all the different windows of distribution. That's one of those things that sounds like a good idea, but if you think about it, it's a really bad idea. Why? Because as a title, especially a theatrical title, goes through the different windows of distribution between theatrical and reruns, you're looking at maybe 5 years for a movie that performs well. And what happens is you get a lot of advertising for the theatrical, to the point where, because DVDs and home video in general was so enormous that it made more money than theatrical when you had a hit because of all the windows under that. But Hollywood is not anything if not fickle. And the whole idea that physical media was getting a little bit long in the tooth. What do I mean by that? I mean the sales were rolling off. Why were the sales rolling off? Now, I don't hear other people say this, but it's so obvious that they should. Physical media rolls off in sales when you run out of old titles that are good. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that there's, and I know I'm going to get killed by my film fans, there are only a limited number of really, really solid titles going all the way back to the beginning of cinema that people will pay money for. There's a lot of stuff that the collectors, the teachers, and people like that will buy. But we're not talking about the big part of the market then. We're talking about a segment of it. And if you get to the point where all of your Casablancas, all of your Wizard of Oz's, all of your Gone with the Winds, all of your Mrs. Minivers, see, I'm starting to get lower on the priority list, all of your Gentlemen's Agreements, all of your River of No Returns, all of your cans have been sold already, you're now getting to the point where there is no new title that people want. So you're doing reversions, and DVDs made a big boo-boo because they came out with Blu-ray not only as a competitive with HD DVD. Blu-ray won, as it should have, but they introduced it too early. Because most of the time, before you introduce a new technology, people have had to have found dissatisfaction with the old. DVD was a massive improvement over VHS. And a lot of it was technical. I'm not going to go into it. But it looked substantially better than Laserdisc as well. So DVD should have been left exclusive because it debuted in 1997-98. So really, before 2010, they shouldn't have even thought of releasing it because you had people just finish rebuying their entire collections from VHS and Beta, like some of us. But are they going to be willing to buy it again this quickly? Remember, home video was in control from 1977 when Andre Blay first opened up magnetic home video and licensed the 20th Century Fox titles. So that gave them the better part of 20 years before DVD came along. So people had time to begin to feel dissatisfied. I'm not saying it had to be 20 years, but certainly 12 is where it should come in, because around 12 years is when you started getting Super VHS, ED Beta, and digital cameras and all of that. So it should have waited until at least 12 years, but they didn't. They jumped the gun, and they had a competitive format that they didn't suppress. So that made people a little bit pissed. So Blu-ray was always an underperformer until more recently. But notice the difference in time between when Blu-ray debuted and 4K came out. There was enough time for people to pick up on all the eccentricities of Blu-ray and get sick of the problems. And that's why 4K looks so good, because it has a much better color space, right? It looks much better. And so here's where you have the streaming services say physical media is obsolete. And the moment they started saying it, they tried to make it happen, because the studios had never quite gotten over that they no longer controlled the rights to everything in perpetuity, that people could own a copy and have that copy forever. or at least until the tape died or whatever. And so they wanted to claim it back. So they kind of hurried it. Look at Blu-ray and DVD sales internationally. Yes, in the US, Best Buy stops having it. So everyone says, oh, Blu-ray, DVD. Who wants that? I need the space. Okay. Not true in Japan. Japan has much less space, but you still have incredible physical media sales. So that was another mistake that the studios made and Netflix made for not outputting on Blu-ray. I understand why they didn't, but it was a mistake because they got rid of a potential release window. I mean, some of them came out, but you know what I'm saying. Anyway, what happened next was even more cataclysmic. And that is almost everything that Netflix did was high end, but not everything was must see. So there's one thing when you do a big stunt like The Irishman, and okay, it brought a certain number of people. They tried to release it theatrically. It, based on the tracking and all that, they said, you know what? Let's not release anything theatrically and let's just completely go in for streaming. And it made sense. Why did it make sense? Because they didn't know what they didn't know. By not having multiple windows, by not having a title out there exploited for a period of 3 to 5 years, it can disappear pretty quickly. And what they also didn't realize is not everything would be a house of cards. And by making things for binge, you don't have a lot of episodes. You don't have a way of monetizing it other than within your own service. And the only way you can monetize it within your own service is to get new subscribers because of that title. You can say it's the whole collection of titles, but it doesn't matter. You're still spending a lot of money that you have no other way of getting back. Going back to when I said 3 years, well, what about video originals? Doesn't matter if it has a full advertising blitz. Let's say you have some $1 million or less thriller, and it came out in home video and like Night Eyes or something, and it had enough of a viewership. Well, now that's going to generate its own. But the things that are like it will be carried along. And as Night Eyes goes from home video to basic cable, whether it's Skinamax or whatever, it gets advertised again. Maybe only as clips in a laundry list of other titles. It's still there. Then it comes on basic cable and free TV. And they say, oh, first time on basic cable, first time on free TV. So that title keeps appearing. Even if it's only on your subconscious level, you still keep seeing that title. How many people can name, and I'm going to make this easy, how many people can name 5 titles from Netflix that debuted during the pandemic? There was a heck of a lot more than that made an impression. But I'll bet you that when you tried to think of it in the moment, you couldn't think of them. Because once they drop, once people watch them, once people are in the waiting mode for the next season to drop, or it's over, there's no reason for you to remember it. It is gone. So the other unexpected thing that was part of this was that China was buying more and more and more titles. And so the prognosticators, who, remember, don't come from show business, they come from Wall Street. So they are looking at it differently from a Hollywood person. And they're looking at China and saying, well, Chinese market is the size of all of North America and half of Europe. So we can spend like drunken sailors on shore leave and never not make money. What happens when people get that idea in their head that it's possible to make something that's a POS and not lose money? Does that mean they're going to go after the best people in the business? Are they going to go after the best projects? Or are they going to go after the projects that will help them the most politically, meaning for their next jobs? Meaning at this time, there were still agency packages of projects, which would mean you'd greenlight. If you were a development exec, you were often from agencies. That's a whole other story that I won't go into here. And so you had a loyalty to the agency that placed you more than the company that was paying you. So you had an incentive for moral hazard to pick the wrong projects just because they would help you. Wrong projects meaning you're spending a lot of money for something that will never make it back. But the temptation of China was there. And plus, you had irrational exuberance on the part of the venture capital community. Because remember, this is still Netflix early days as a content producer. And they started making prognostications that Netflix would eventually have 400,000 subscribers. Possible, especially when they were factoring in China at that point. Here's the bad part. The irrational exuberance extended to all of the studios that were making their own streaming services. See the problem? So all of a sudden, you had a lot of enthusiasm for Disney as it got closer and closer and closer until its Disney Plus launch. They were spending $10, $12 billion setting it up. The fact that they got Tubi from 20th Century Fox when they spent $71 billion to not even get everything, but they were flying high and they thought they could spend any amount of money and it wouldn't matter. Haha. Why didn't they just repurpose Tubi? Why didn't they just repurpose that? Use the infrastructure that was always there. Why did they have to build it from scratch? Anyway, they spend all of this money preparing for their launch. Paramount's doing the same thing. Peacock, Comcast, about 85% of its business is cable infrastructure, and that includes providing broadband services. So, stop it with the cable's dead. It's not. That'll be another video. But they were kind of like, let's be careful here. Let's not spend this kind of crazy money. Because Peacock, as their streaming service, it's kind of undistinguished, but it also wasn't expensive to set up. They did it fairly reasonably. Warner Brothers, flush with irresponsibility because they were being bought out by AT&T. So they thought, here comes Mr. Moneybags. We don't have to pay attention to anything we're doing. We can burn down Game of Thrones. We can destroy The Watcher. We can destroy everything because we're not going to be here anymore. Well, hell, we don't even have to have proper paperwork, as it turned out. And so they were spending crazy as well to come up with their streaming service. And Sony, which is sitting there going, they're spending a lot of money. Why? I don't think this justifies that. Plus, by this point, they'd had a problem with Ghostbusters. And they said, making good money on our games, we're making good money on the stuff we're producing here. Let's not spend that money. Plus, remember, Sony was the creator of the initial Betamax, so they understood Japan and the desire for physical media, which never went away. I know I just said that before, but I gotta say it again. This repetition is the mother of pedagogy, right? And they were saying, no. we've got a good business in physical media. We've got a lot of stuff happening there. Maybe not in the US, but we're not gonna cannibalize the rest of the world to satisfy the US. Smartest move Sony ever made, by the way. One of the smartest. Getting rid of Goober Peters was the first smartest thing they ever did, but this was another one. Also, not firing Amy Pascal after the first Ghostbusters and giving her a chance to redeem herself. That was genius, and it worked well enough, at least initially. So then COVID hits, and everyone's locked at home. So Disney launches, Max launches, everyone's launching. Everyone is spending lots of money on shows, ridiculous amounts. And Mulan bombs in China. China's real estate bubble starts collapsing. China, there's a whole host of other stuff here. We won't go into that. But China basically says we're not interested in US content anymore. So that means they have no way of covering their losses because there's no more China to equal North America plus half of Europe anymore. But in the end, so, and this is the end, that leads us to kind of where we are today, with basically Netflix, which has remained smart this whole time, seeing that the winds were changing. 2022, first 2 quarters, Netflix, for the first time, loses subscribers. First it was 100,000. Then they were afraid second quarter they might lose up to 2 million. They only lost 1 million. So because they overestimated how bad it was going to be, Wall Street kind of forgave them. But during that second quarter, Netflix did not rest on its laurels. It looked at what it had done and what it was doing. And what it was doing was it had approximately 19 billion with a B dollars to spend per year on their actual programming, whether it be licenses or whether it be originals. And up until that point, they had been spending between 13 and 15 billion of that on new projects. Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos said, no, not anymore. And what they did in a flash of an eye, to the point where most other people didn't even realize what they were doing, they said, we're going to flip that number. We're going to spend 13 to 15 billion on licenses and only 4 to 5 billion on originals. Their first move was to spend $500 million at Warner Brothers to relicense Friends, Seinfeld, and a couple of other shows. It was a package, and it was unprecedented because Zaslav had a Warner Brothers after AT&T realized after 2 years, we're not going to try to even figure this out anymore. We're going to sell it. And everyone says, why did Zaslav buy it? It's like, get it. No one else wanted it. It was either Zaslav and Discovery take it and try to make something of it, or it gets sold for parts. AT&T was so fed up that they were willing to write down more than half of their initial investment in 2 years.
Karen, do you have any siblings?
No.
Zaslav was the only choice they had, other than a complete wipeout of Warner Brothers, which would mean it would be a fire sale. which would mean everything would be sold for cheap. So leave Zaslav alone and say, oh, he keeps destroying Warner Brothers. He's taken. No, he didn't. He is the only reason that studio still exists. He still makes mistakes, but he's done more correct things than wrong. One day we'll discuss the Acme. There's a whole dead cat on the line there that obviously is not being revealed. I think it was an IP theft that no one discovered until it was too late. Because there's no other reason for him not to sell it off, other than a lawsuit was pending. Anyway, third quarter of 2022, just based on their strategic acquisitions, which included the licensing of Cartoon Networks from Warner Brothers, with the idea that if some of the shows that Warner Brothers seemed to have canceled were successful on Netflix, Netflix would license Warner Brothers to do more. Meanwhile, independent production companies, Legendary, A24, Lionsgate, all looked at what Netflix did, breathed a sigh of relief, and said, oh, they're licensing. That means we can actually do our movies theatrically. We actually can have other windows that we still control. That means that our business isn't only as well-paid hired guns. This is a win for us. Let's ramp up our development slate. Make sure Netflix wants it, but now we can plan for theatricals. Now we can plan for doing things that fill niches, which we couldn't do when everything was only streaming. So, fourth quarter, 7 million new subscribers. That is an historic turnaround. I have never, in all my studies of Hollywood, seen a company pivot that quickly on a disaster and actually make the right decisions after it. Or see things that give you nightmares. So, where we are now is Netflix controls slightly more than 55% of the entire streaming world. Second is Amazon Prime, which most people don't even consider because they would pay that service anyway because of the shipping. Although at $140, that's getting not so great anymore. For the other studios, now they're in a frantic mood because look at how much it's costing per episode. At its worst, you had She-Hulk costing $27 million for an episode that got per episode that got less views than some of the higher end or the more successful YouTube channels. And they're spending that much money. And we know that they've canceled the second season of She-Hulk. So that means She-Hulk is a dead IP. It's gone. It has no value. How many series have done that across all the streaming services? I'm doing it for me. Okay. Then we hit the strike, right? There's a whole other side to that strike. Remember, I've been through every strike since 1988, and they all ended exactly the same way. This one was no different. We'll discuss that later. But the bottom line, Netflix is controlling most. You're starting to see the realization that streaming is not going to be nirvana, and that the people who are still playing the game have to make alliances with each other. Notice What is one of the biggest alliances that is played now? The ad-supported streaming services are now making deals with the cable companies to be on their basic tier. That's a pretty cataclysmic thing that's happened. And there's going to be more. The death of linear media, as foretold, is ahead of the reality, just like the death of physical media is ahead of the reality. The reality of streaming is that there's enough room for perhaps three, maybe four players. Remember, there were only 3 networks for the longest time. There were only a couple of big premium cable channels. And yes, you had a lot of individual channels, but many of those individual channels were controlled by very few players. So it still wasn't really as many people as are out there now. Plus, costs were controlled. Streaming costs were irresponsible. The loss of China was devastating. And it still hasn't quite been made up, because that meant that all of these overages that were spent will never be made up. The other thing that happened was with no China, and with the ease with which one can switch from one premium service to another, not like the old days, we had to call the cable company, and after an hour and a half of frustration, waiting on the line, talking to people, getting dropped, having to call again, and then being told that, oh, well, you know, if you keep it, you're going to get this discount. And then going, okay, fine, I'll keep it, right? No, you just cancel it. If you want it to come back, you do it again. They found that most people will keep a couple of baseline subscriptions, and then they'll rotate between the others. Many instances they have just one. And what's that one? Netflix. And then if there's something on one of the other services, they'll subscribe to that. A month or two, watch everything they want, drop it again.
Well, this isn't my first time in Beverly Hills.
It appears that rather than 400 million people available for streaming service, the actual population for all the streaming services put together is maybe 500 million, if that. So that's why in streaming, they are trying to figure out a way to cut costs, keep audiences. This is why, in spite of some of the challenges that are happening within that universe, I remain bullish, because I think ultimately it's going to be a win-win. You're going to see a world that attempts to do multiple windows again. You already see it. Look at how the holdovers moved from Netflix to Peacock. Other things are going to move from Peacock to Netflix or Amazon Prime, including Netflix shows going to Amazon Prime shows coming to Netflix. It's the cash flow that matters. And they will figure it out. Hollywood always does. But this is why we're in the situation we're in right now. There was an overemphasis and a crazy exuberance for streaming that was never going to happen. And that's okay. Hollywood's made these same mistakes before, and it's always managed to come back, no matter how dire it was. But when it's coming back, that is the promised land of opportunity.